From the Illinois State Capitol Rotunda, Capitol Bureau Chief Mark Maxwell is asking the tough questions. This is Capitol Connection.
Welcome to Capitol Connection. I'm Mark Maxwell, reporting from the Illinois State House on this Sunday, April 25th. The trial of Derek Chauvin turned America's sights back on the push for justice and police accountability. On the same day, a Minnesota jury found Chauvin guilty of murdering George Floyd. House Democrats in Illinois pumped the brakes on a renewed push to end qualified immunity, that legal shield that protects police officers from facing civil lawsuits.
It is a bill that we're slowing down. It's a very difficult issue, not just here locally in Illinois, all across our country, and of course federal Congress taking this up as well. Not something that members are wanting to sweep under the rug, but we want to take a comprehensive approach.
That qualified immunity is an effective legal shield that protects police officers from many civil lawsuits. Joining us now is House Democrat Curtis Tarver, who's renewed that push to end qualified immunity. Thank you for joining us.
Absolutely, thanks for having me.
I want to give you some numbers. You're probably familiar with these. Chicago spent $249.7 million on police misconduct cases from 2010 to 2014. In 2018, the city spent $45 million settling police misconduct cases in that year alone. Last year, the city spent another $13 million to settle at least 7 different lawsuits or complaints in the city. That's more than $300 million in about a 10-year span or so. Is there a case to be made that with qualified immunity, the burden falls on the taxpayer to settle these cases?
No, I don't think so. I think what you'll find if there's qualified immunity is that municipalities will do a better job of vetting individuals who they bring on board, providing training and resources for them.
Well, the municipalities are the ones on the hook now to pay that settlement.
Right, no, I understand that, but I think ultimately what you'll see is a decrease in the amount of settlements and cases that move forward to some extent, because I think you'll have better trained officers. You'll have individuals who are, again, more properly vetted on the way in and more resources allocated toward the officers as opposed to lawsuits.
Now, officers can still face criminal prosecution in some cases.
That's correct. Qualified immunity is related to a civil doctrine, and criminal is a totally different wheelhouse.
Take me back to January.
Sure.
What happened? Qualified immunity was in the bill, the police reform bill. It came out.
Yeah, it came out. I wasn't a part of those negotiations. I was someone who I think, internally and publicly was very adamant that qualified immunity should stay in the criminal justice pillars. I think that to not have it in there is somewhat of a disservice to the overall purpose of the pillar.
And yet there were some of your colleagues, House Democrats, who felt, anxious, flustered, rattled even, that it would come back, that you would bring qualified immunity back so quickly, when I think some of them might have felt that they had put the paperweight of a task force on top of qualified immunity and said, we're not going to touch that for a while.
Sure. I think there was some trepidation by certain members within the caucus to deal with the issue as quickly as we have. I think part of it is the education piece, quite honestly. Based on my discussions with individuals, I think a lot of people are still confused about what qualified immunity is. And perhaps for some of them, the task force vetting the issue will provide them the opportunity to learn more about it. Certainly it's disheartening for me that that's the route that's being taken, but I can understand, for individuals who either don't come in contact with law enforcement in the same way that a lot of Black and brown individuals do, or don't know anyone who's had those same type of interactions, I think it could be difficult for them.
How much of those interactions that go wrong do you think is a factor of intent versus fear?
Well, let me just be honest with you, and honest with everyone who's watching. The fear is significant. And if this were a situation where we had predominantly white individuals being shot and killed or maimed or harmed or had dogs sicked on them, or like in Springfield, we see that an officer takes the remains of a 2-year-old in an urn and desecrates it by pointing it on the street. I think if we saw that and there were white individuals involved, then we wouldn't be having this conversation. I think things would have moved probably on a bipartisan basis, quite honestly, because I think the one thing that separates us in this space is just really the race of the individuals who are the victims of law enforcement's overzealousness at times and excessive force.
There's that perceived or subconscious value that we ascribe to people that look like us, I think is what you're saying. Just to give a bit more background, I believe you were referencing the case of Tanaja Barnes. It was a tragic story she was a child who died under the care of the Department of Children and Family Services. Someone in her family, her surviving family, was pulled over in a traffic stop and an officer in Springfield. There's an ongoing, I think, a court case about this, but in the process of, I don't know, looking through the car, desecrated her remains that was in an urn of some kind, I believe.
Sure. And I mean, I think that the important thing to note is if you look at the lawsuit, his defense is qualified immunity, which is essentially saying, hey, I never knew, because you've never had a case before where someone desecrated the remains of a 2-year-old, you can't say that it's reasonable for an officer to know I can't do that, right? I mean, I want to be clear, there was a bill that said if you are a police officer and you commit criminal sexual assault against a child, then we have the ability to go through administrative process to strip your pension. That was 477 and then 1429. Law enforcement slipped in opposition to that. So I think we have to be very, very clear what kind of mindset we're talking about, where individuals who are sworn to serve and protect say, well, if you potentially take away my pension for committing first-degree murder or criminally sexually assaulting a child, then I'm in opposition to that.
Was that for all felonies?
It was an enumerated list of felonies, which was first-degree murder, second-degree murder, and it trailed off. But most of them were child pornography, criminal sexual assault of a child. And it was a litmus test to see what law enforcement would do when we're talking about the most vulnerable in society.
Representative Mark Batnick was our guest last week. He suggested that same stripping of the pension should apply to all government workers. What do you think?
Actually, I have no issue with that. I have no issue with that at all. I don't think that, listen, for me, myself, I'm only speaking on behalf of myself, if I commit criminal sexual assault of a child or first-degree murder, I do not believe, and this is not a partisan thing for me, that taxpayers should be on the hook to pay my pension. I don't believe so.
I want to look at this from a bit of a different angle, this issue of qualified immunity.
Sure.
We rattled off at the top of this discussion the large dollar amounts that many of these victims' families, the victims themselves even, are receiving. Also, their trial lawyers are taking a cut, as we know. The average police officer in Illinois makes $56,000. I don't know if the victim gets a better deal going after the municipality or after the police officer. There's just not a lot of money there in the police officer's pockets.
Yeah, I don't think that anybody really anticipates police officers being sued. One, they have indemnification, which means the municipality is going to be on the hook. The only way you can sue a municipality is to name the police officer. The municipality has to have an agent in order for you to sue.
So you don't see this still coming out of the police officer's pocket, it still comes out of the city?
I don't think so. I think if it did, then we'd see a decrease in some of the excessive force cases that we see now. But there was absolutely no political will to hold police officers accountable in that capacity.
So I'm learning this along the way too. That's the first time I've heard that police officers have indemnification, but I was under the impression that if qualified immunity was removed, because the court said, okay, now that officer would have financial liability on the line, that officer could have to pay damages. Is that incorrect in your?
I think it depends on what bill we're talking about. But in my bill, I think it was relatively silent on that factor. And the reality is this: anyone worth their salt, any lawyer worth their salt knows this. If you're trying to sue somebody who has essentially just a house as an asset, you're not going to get very much anyway. That police officer, as an absolute worst case scenario, and I'm not suggesting that we want this, if there were a judgment against him or her, would file for bankruptcy and the family would never recover regardless. Right. So it's not a real, in that capacity. I don't know that, again, I think if officers had to pay something, whether it was $5,000, $10,000, $20,000.
Some of your colleagues have said they want to see officers with more skin in the game.
I mean, I would love to see that too, but I just don't think that there's any political will in Illinois to ever see that. Again, law enforcement is a very significant lobby, and I don't see that people will actually support a bill with law enforcement. Unfortunately, the law enforcement has real skin in the game. I think the onus is going to have to be on municipalities to do better in hiring, training, and supporting officers, and hopefully that will allow us to see a decrease in some of these activities. Mm-hmm.
We've heard from police that when they put the badge on in the morning, they're willingly putting their life on the line when they go to work. why should they put their house on the line too?
Well, one, being a police officer is a choice. Nowhere else in society does anyone have that level of unfettered discretion and the ability to take someone's life. So certainly we all understand that they have a tremendous responsibility, and we appreciate that. And the focus is not for the overwhelming majority of individuals who really are serving and protecting and doing their best. We're talking about how do you get to those who commit the most egregious crimes. And statistics show and research shows that we're not talking about 95% of the force. We're talking about those handful of people who commit the overwhelming majority of these egregious atrocities.
There's a number of police accountability measures, including databases to track police officers in different places, opening up anonymous complaints, increased use of body cameras, all these things coming to Illinois because of the police reform bill that passed into law. But I want to move from the policy a minute to talk about the personal. I understand that you had a run-in not that long ago.
Sure.
Can you take us back to what happened? What happened?
Absolutely. I have to preface it by saying that my predecessor, because I was in my district, is a 77-year-old white woman. And I say that to say, I don't think the treatment that I received and what she would have received is the same. I was pulled over for, I think they said I had a headlight out. Immediately the question was, do you have a firearm in the car? Right? There's video of it, but the officers actually asked me to hand him my firearm. We've seen what's happened nationally with people being shot and killed for far less. Ultimately,
you did have a firearm in the car?
Yes, I had a valid concealed carry. I've had it since July of 2019, whenever we first could have concealed carry.
But that's a nerve-wracking thing to do.
Absolutely. And the officer said that it wasn't updated in their system. Although everything had been renewed, it wasn't updated in their system. So I was taken, I had 6 police officers, come to the scene, take me to the police station, cuff me for 7 hours, refused to give me the ability to make a phone call. And the only reason I was ever allowed to leave was because my younger sister showed up at 2:30 in the morning, who also happens to be an attorney. And then they found out that I'm a licensed attorney.
And also an elected official at the time.
An elected official. And they also found out that I used to work for the department that investigates police misconduct. And then voila, I was allowed to leave and go home. In the same car with one headlight that they pulled me over in.
Interesting. How does that inform your view? That was one incident, sure, right, of a lifetime of possible incidents. But how does that inform your view, or how does it fuel your motive to change the way we police citizens?
I think if something can happen to me, I think in this instance where I am a lawyer, I am elected, right? Everybody else on 60-something in Stony Island don't get that, they don't get the benefit of the doubt. Everybody doesn't have, you shouldn't have to have a sibling who's an attorney who pops up to be able to be released for something that you were not wrong in, right? And all the charges were dropped against me. So I think what it did was for me to allow me to understand a lot more people in my district and otherwise who are not as fortunate, who don't have the means that I have, and how easily they can be caught up in a criminal justice system. So I wouldn't say that it's a motive, but it definitely was something that sparked more interest in this space.
How do you evaluate the jury's verdict in the Derek Chauvin case?
I think it was the right verdict. What I'm concerned about is that people will look at that and say, okay, everything is, there's accountability. Here it is on the criminal side, this person is being held accountable, and therefore we don't have to look at, qualified immunity and other things, because it's now been proven that when somebody has their knee on someone's neck for 9 minutes and it goes viral and it's on national TV, then in that instance, justice has been served. But it's about the many situations where that is, there is no camera. There are not a lot of onlookers that I'm more concerned about.
I imagine you've seen the video of the shooting of Adam Toledo in Chicago.
I have.
What should happen to that officer?
I think that's a tougher situation. I think that was something that most people are going to say and see as a split-second decision. I think he should get the treatment that anyone else would get as far as a thorough investigation. And if there's something that is against policy, then he should be held to whatever standard that is. But I don't think, and I'm no soothsayer, but I don't think that ultimately that's going to be considered an unjustified shooting, and I don't think ultimately that there'll be criminal charges pressed against that officer.
All right. Representative Curtis Tarver, House Democrat from Chicago, thank you for joining us on this discussion of ending qualified immunity. We're going to continue that discussion on the other side of this break with House Republican Patrick Windhorst, a longtime prosecutor, who's going to look at this judicial doctrine, qualified immunity. It's not a state law. What does it mean, and what would it mean if that practice were to end? We're back in a moment.